Good morning from New York, and welcome to Bubble Webinar's Getting Started Responsive Design. My name is Nirja, and I'm a technical account manager at Bubble. I'm excited to walk you through the platform and show you how to use responsive design while building your app. So thank you for joining me today. Before we get started, let's discuss what is responsive design. Responsive design is an approach to web design that makes pages look good on a variety of devices, page widths, and device orientation. Today, we'll be diving into the fundamentals of making a page responsive across desktop, tablet, and phone using Airbnb's design patterns as a guide. This webinar will be recorded, and we will email you a link after this session so you can always rewatch at your convenience. For the method of this webinar, I'm going to be switching between a meeting roadmap so we can keep track of our progress, Airbnb's website, and a test app we'll build together in Bubble. The roadmap will have some text for your future reference, but don't worry about caching it all, as most of our focus will be on the test app. We'll also have a Q&A open where you can ask questions. We will leave some time at the end to cover top questions. So with that, let's begin. The topics we'll cover today include popular brands, UI patterns and style guides, responsive tools in Bubble and Chrome, properties for width, margins, and alignment, and combining components to build a responsive page. So the first few topics that we'll cover are UI patterns and style guides. So your question would be, what is a UI pattern? A UI pattern are visual solutions to common usability problems. Patterns include guidelines for themes, components, and usability. So these are really important when you want to start out with your research process on how to design your app. You obviously have your top brands in mind when you're designing your app, something that you're big fans of and want to copy and adapt it to your own use. So I have 3 examples here that I'll quickly walk you through. So the first one is the Human Interface Guidelines by Apple. I'm just going to pull up the other ones as well. Material Design by Google, and also a pattern library. So starting out with the Human Interface Guidelines, this is Apple's guideline on how to design your app when you sell on the iOS App Store. It includes information about their themes. It can include information about their visual design, animation, basic things like icons and images. So Apple is quite prescriptive on creating a unified experience for your users, regardless of which company is selling their app through the iOS App Store. Similarly, Google also has something called Material Design, where it walks you through things like typography, also like colors, and gives you a few guidelines on using color palettes for usability and what that says about your brand. While this is not limited to Android marketplace, it's definitely more popular amongst Android apps. So these are definitely things that you can look at when you're trying to figure out what works for your app. And then the last thing I wanted to show you is this site that looks at the different UI patterns across common apps. The focus is on iOS apps, but you can adapt this to whichever platform that you're using. So for example, Robinhood is a financial app, and then a really cool one is Rent the Runway, where you can look at different screens that a user would see while interacting with this app. So this kind of gives you inspiration of what you can build in your app and kind of what is the flow of users clicking through things, what is the experience that they get through, what color schemes you can see. So it's a mixture of predictability and also excitement. And this is a good starting point for when you're building your own app. And then let us also look at something called style guides. And that is more personalized than a UI pattern because a style guide is a company's branding guidelines. It can include details regarding the company's values or recent case studies in addition to the UI patterns that we just covered. So the one that we're going to focus on in this session is Airbnb. So let's start with that. A few people are complaining about no sound. Is that still an issue? Okay, great. Because I believe it's working for Chrome. Okay, so if some of you are not able to hear sound or like sound is coming on and off, like we'll have a video recording at the end that can definitely help. Okay, so moving on to Airbnb's design guide. Looking at through these different like resources on this page, you can see that they're driven by their values. They also want to be a bit unconventional. And then there are different articles that are available for your perusal that talks about different aspects of their design and how they applied it to like different locations and target markets. So this is a great way for you to like see how did companies think about their brand and then turn it into their design to give users a very specific experience in a certain location or for a specific purpose. So while we're actually like looking at the Airbnb example, I want to focus on one page, which is their host page. This is a page geared towards people who want to host on Airbnb, and the page mostly walks you through the pros of hosting on Airbnb, how much you can earn, as well as like how Airbnb helps you earn more and takes care of some of your concerns. So there's a lot going on this page that I'll walk you through. But one of the main tools that we'll use in looking at external websites and adapting it to your app is something called Chrome DevTools. Chrome DevTools is a loose collection of features for developers, out of which like one feature called device mode is extremely useful. Here's some information based on your OS, how you can access this. I'm going to show you one right now. And so on a Mac, you can do Command Option J, and it pulls up something that looks like this. You can see a few options on the top, and then you can also see something here called Toggle Device Toolbar. If I click on it, it looks normal without this console, which I can close out of. But if I enable the toggle, then it gives me a few options right here again. And so the options right here is set to laptop here because this simulates the viewport of a laptop. But you can also change the device to something like an iPhone 10. And I'll show you here something that looks like your iPhone's viewport. You can also change it to something like an iPad. That will show you an iPad's vertical orientation viewport. And then you can also change it to landscape mode, where it's wider, and so obviously the content reorients itself to fit that wider space. And then while we're looking at the Chrome DevTools, we can also like inspect certain parts of Airbnb's design, where, for example, you're looking at this button. You can click on it and inspect. And here I've had this. Let me change this to a bottom orientation. And then I can have a little more space to show you what I'm showing. So if you click on different elements right here and you click inspect, it'll show you that here, this is a button type. And then if you click on computed, it'll give you some information on the dimensions. So this is a lot of information to process. Bubble makes this much more simpler. So once we head into the Bubble example, you'll see what all this means. So we're going to interpret parts of Airbnb's design and try to adapt it into a page that we design in Bubble. And part of that, we're going to be using a few different properties. I'm not going to walk you through all of these right now, but we'll walk through it once we're going through the examples in our app. And so what we're going to be doing is adapting parts of Airbnb's host page and implementing navigation bars, a background image with an overlay, some paragraphs, tables, and links within those table cells that will adapt to each device size. So before we head in, I just want to check in again. It seems a few of you are still reporting audio issues. Have those been resolved? Okay. So heading back to the Airbnb host page, let's walk through a few different segments of this page. So on the top, you have something that is a floating bar on desktop view, because you can see as you continue to scroll, you still see this little banner on the top. And then you have a few different sections, and then at the bottom, there's a static footer. There's nothing floating at the bottom. And so the header includes a few things like the page links, the logo, and a button to get started. The next, you see a background image with a form where you can see, okay, I want to host for a private room with a certain number of guests. How much money can I earn? And then the next section gives you like 2 paragraphs of text. This includes more text, but in like 3 blocks rather than 2. And then here, this will be an image with a quote. And this image and quote combination will appear again if you scroll to the bottom right here. And here you can see this includes the same 3-block setup that we saw on the top, but without like the itemed numbers right here. And then if you scroll all the way to the bottom, you'll see a few different links where if you like click on one of these links, you will see a pop-up with this setup right here. And then you can say X out of it, and that closes the pop-up. And at the bottom, there's the usual footer that's across pretty much every single brand. So this is our desktop view. Now, if you see this on a mobile view, this is going to change. And so let me move back to site layout. And then I'm going to see this on an iPad. And let me change the orientation to an iPad portrait. And let me zoom in a little further so you can see what this looks like. Okay, so on an iPad, there's no more header on the top. You don't see it. So you just see the picture that we had after the header on the desktop. And then the little square that we had here where you had this form to search how much money you can earn, that becomes a full-on group underneath. And then you can see where you had these 2 on the same line, these 2 paragraphs, they're stacked. And there's a stacking structure repeated across the page. And then where you have the links rather than forming in 2 columns, you see it all in 1 column. And when you click on the links, it's the same pop-up. We'll see this behavior change once we change it to phone. And so when you scrolled, you saw something where the header just appeared at a certain position on the page. So this is interesting. On the desktop side, you had a continuous header. It just remained in place. But when you are on a mobile device, the header appears only after a certain position. It's after you pass the picture. So this is something we're going to try and recreate in our own app. And then let's look at phone as well. So on iPhone 10, we have the same thing with the tablet where we don't have a header on the top until we scroll. And then we see a header. And then you separately also see a footer at the bottom. And this is interesting because the footer is basically the part of our desktop. It's the right part of the header of our desktop. And that becomes a footer on our iPhone 10. And so you can see that this page looks very slightly different across devices, but it's to make sure that you have a consistent user experience and that the content fits the viewport available. And so here back in our links section, when you click on this, it takes up the full viewport. So it's not like a centered pop-up, because creating a centered pop-up in a very small viewport would be hard to read. So to be user-friendly, it takes up this full space and blocks out the rest of the background. So these are some of the main differences between device sizes for the same page in Airbnb. And we're going to be building this in our app. So to kind of give you a preview, we're going to be implementing our nav bars, where we'll create floating headers and footers based on the device. Then we'll have our background image, which will have the form either taking up a right spot or like spanning the whole page. Then we'll have paragraphs that will remain on one row or could be stacked. Then we'll have tables that can be either 2 columns or 1 column. And then links that can either have a centered pop-up or take up the full viewport. Okay, so with that, let's just start with our app. And I have an app right here. You can see a blank page, but I set up a few things before the session where I kind of looked at Airbnb style guide in greater depth, and I saw that they have a certain font size specification. They have a certain color scheme for different buttons. And I tried to like mimic that so that, we can kind of get a closer experience to the host page while building our own page. And that's something that you can do as well. If you like a certain brand, just dig into their style guide and see what patterns you can see so that you can adapt it for your own app. Okay, so back on our blank page. To start with, we're just going to set it up. This is really basic stuff. We're going to draw a few different groups. We're going to add a few colors to differentiate it, and then you'll see what we're going to use them for. So to start with, I'm going to make the page not fixed width, because I want the page to be able to expand and contract based on the device. And then the width we can leave as, looks like that 980, and the height, I'm going to call it 1582. You can choose a size that works for you. I just want some convenient numbers. And then let's call that host. Okay. And then let's draw a few groups. So we're going to be drawing about 5 groups, and I'll tell you what those are for. So let's change the first group size to width. Let's make it full width of the page, and then let's make this height 82 and align it to the top left of this page. And then I'm going to add 4 more, but they'll be larger than this initial one. I'm just going to put that underneath. So this one, I'm going to make it about, let's see, 500. And then another one underneath. Just lock that in place. I'm going to make that 400. This one can be 500 as well. And you'll see what I'm doing. It's a little boring, but it'll help us understand things much better. Let's make this about 100 and lock that in place. Okay. All right. So now I'm going to give them a few different colors so that we know what we're doing. We can leave the header white. And let's make this pink. Shade. Okay. All right. So we have a few different groups here. And question about what do you mean by locking the group in place? So basically, Bubble will allow you to draw a group. And then if you wanted to kind of just match up with another group on the edge, you can kind of press down and like drag it up, and it'll show you like a locking symbol at the edges where you know that it's exactly coinciding with the border of another group. That allows you to like design more neatly. Okay, and so for the first one, this is actually where we're going to have a floating header. And you'll see what I mean. Let's just preview it to see what this page looks like. I'm going to remove the debugger. So at the moment, you can just see like a few different bands coinciding with what we just built. And there's nothing there, but we're going to add content. So the first part is where we're going to have a floating header, which either shows up for desktop consistently or gets hidden for mobile. So what we're going to do is for the first group, we're going to say this element is collapse this element's height when hidden. And we're going to add a condition on when this collapses. So before we do that, let's just start drawing our floating groups. So you can start again at the top of the page. And here, let's make this our 980, which is the full page, and the height, we can make this 82. And then that's our floating header. We also want a floating footer. So you know this is a header because it vertically floats relative to the top. We can leave it as left, and the floating z-index is above elements because we want it to stay above all the other elements. So I'm just going to copy this over and like take this down to the bottom of our page, which would be around 1500 because its height is 82. So if I scroll all the way to the bottom, it's right here. I'm going to just add a solid color so that we can see what it is. Okay, so that's how you know you have a floating footer. And this is your floating header. And so for footer, we need to update this vertically float relative to the bottom. And so when you preview, you can see there's your floating header, and then there's also your floating, let's remove the debugger because the debugger can actually influence your page height. So there's your floating header and your floating footer. And one thing with floating header is it might, let's bring it to front to be safe, and let's give it a more distinct color. Just to make sure we have this floating on the top. Yep, we do. Okay, so it retains on scroll, and the floating footer retains on scroll. And then now let's look at adding page links, just like we had on Airbnb. So on Airbnb, you can see there's a logo, there are a few page links, and then this little call to action right here, which we want to copy. And back here, we can, in our editor, let's just add a place for the logo. And I'm going to choose an image and then just draw a small space for icon. Let's make it a little smaller. And then I'm going to center this vertically. And so the parent is the floating group. And then it currently doesn't have an image. I have an assets folder where I'm going to download it from and upload it from. And then that is this one. Okay. And then I'm going to add a few links to represent the pages. And so let's just call this page 1. And I'm going to update this with something that's closer to Airbnb's font size. And then let's center this vertically as well. And then we're just going to copy a few more so that we have at least 3 different links. Let's just make it look more distinct. Okay, so let us distribute this so that it's more evenly spaced. And then we can group them because we're looking at it as one thing that behaves together. So one of the rule of thumbs in Bubble is that you should group things that behave together, and you can set responsive settings for that group so that you can have consistent behavior and alignment and movement for those certain elements that are grouped together. So let's actually make this a little closer for our logo. And then comparing to Airbnb, we also need this call to action. So we're going to add a few more text elements. So let's add one right here, which says monthly potential. And then I'm going to choose a style that says header. And let's make that a little smaller. And then vertically center it. And then we need something that is there for the numbers which are enlarged here on Airbnb. So let's just add another text element which contains a number. So let's just choose 5,000. And then we need something a little larger. So let's choose, is that too big? Probably not. Okay. And then finally, we also need a button, which I'm going to get from my style guide. So that is this button, get started. And I'm going to paste it over here. Okay, so now if I preview, let's see what happens. You can see these are really spread out. There are a few things wrong. Like, first of all, each of these elements have too much space between them, and we kind of like lose our view of what should be left aligned and what should be right aligned. And that's something that we need to fix in this part of your bubble editor that's called responsive mode. And this is where all the magic happens. And this takes you to the next rule in Bubble, is that when you have a group, and actually we should have grouped all these three together because for the header, they work similarly. And the responsive viewer gives you a few options. First of all, you'll see device sizes right here that will simulate your page by device size. It's kind of what we saw in the Chrome Dev Tools, but this is actually much cooler. And then you'll see hidden elements and page states. We'll come to that in a bit. But going to our original width, that was 980 pixels. We can see that you have this page right here. And when you expand it, it starts losing shape. And when you contract it, it starts everything starts getting stacked. There's not enough space. So that's something we need to fix. So first thing we want to do is let's make the logo will be fixed with, because we don't want the logo to get huge if the page gets larger, and it's left aligned, which is correct because it always stays on the left side of the page. And then this linked section, we also want this left aligned. And for this larger group for the call to action, we want this right aligned. So at least let's make sure that the alignments stay correct as we expand and contract. And that seems to be the case. Now we need to take care of the spacing between elements. And for that, we need to set minimum widths and maximum widths. So here you can see the current minimum width is 20%. That's probably too small. We can't allow it to get too small. So let's see whether we have any flexibility, like how much is this before page 3 falls below. And it's about 90%. So you can set this full group to be minimum width of 90%, that it can get no smaller than 90% of its original size, so that when you contract, it doesn't get stacked. And then for our thing on the right, we probably should make this fixed width because there is not a lot of place for it to expand. So we want consistent behavior. There's actually one more thing that's wrong here, is that there's actually too much space here. So we might actually need to specify a max width as well. So let's make the max width just 100%, so that it doesn't get much larger, but it has a little space. It has a 10% space to kind of contract, and beyond that, it won't. So let's test that. And now we get a little more even behavior for the header. So when you preview, you can see that your page looks aligned and spaced correctly. And using our Chrome Dev Tools, let us see what it looks on our iPad size, still fairly decent. Like you can see the alignment and spacing looks okay. But when you get into your iPhone size, it kind of like stacks, which we don't want. We want a smarter layout because we know that in Airbnb for our phone size, you don't really have a header on the top. So we need to set a few rules. So back in this, we actually need to move a few things off to the floating footer when the page size contracts and make parts of this header hide when the page goes below a certain page width. So a key concept here is breakpoints. For simplicity's sake, we'll just look at two breakpoints. We'll look at an 800 pixel breakpoint and we'll look at a 400 pixel breakpoint. Let's say 800 so our original width is 980. And then once you actually start shrinking the page, you can see that this was highlighted. That means you're getting into like tablet portrait mode. And then when you shrink it even further, you can see that your phone portrait mode was activated. So we're just going to say that the tablet is around 800 pixels and the phone is around 400 pixels. So all our behavior will be like for 800 page width and 400 page width. And desktop is obviously what we're starting out with designing. So let us start by setting up a hiding rule that when very similar to Airbnb, that on an 800 pixel page width, you're not going to see a floating. When you see a floating header, you're not going to see that call to action button. That call to action button will actually move over or like appear in the floating footer. On desktop, you don't have a floating footer, but on tablet and phone, you do have a floating footer. The scroll to position thing, we're going to do it in a little bit. And so back on our page, let us add a hiding rule and say hide when the parent width is less than or equal to 800. And so the parent in this case is the floating header, which spans the entire page width. So we don't have to do any extra math for that and just say save. So what you can see is that when you shrink the page, that disappears. And that's exactly the behavior that you want. But if that disappears, you need it to appear in the footer. So let us just go back to our UI builder and like copy this thing over to our floating footer. Wait, did that copy over? Okay, so let me make sure it is aligned. And then we can vertically center this. Okay, so there's around 17 pixels here. You can see it shows you the spacing. And then the same here. Okay, so we're good for the floating footer to start with, but we actually need to see something. So it looks like the floating footer is always visible, but we don't want it always visible. We only want it visible when the page width is 800 or less. So we need to add a condition for the floating footer in general, like not just this group, just the entire floating footer. So for this, you have to actually go back to the UI builder tab, and then we can add a conditional that says when current page width is greater than 800, this element is not visible. And so let's test that. So on our iPad, we don't actually see, that because it's actually less than 800. But on a laptop, you can see that this monthly potential is on the top. Let us actually make sure that the floating footer includes our buttons. We might have to add one more thing. And let's make sure this does not have any conditionals left over from the floating header, because that might have been a problem. Yeah, we need to remove that. And so when we retest here on our Chrome DevTools, there you go. There this appears with the monthly potential at the bottom. Okay, so we have at least our tablet mode fixed, where we can see the floating header from the desktop break into floating footer as well, and then hide this group here and show the group here. We need to now adapt it for phone, because on the phone, it still looks a little different than what Airbnb's phone size looks like. So if I look at Airbnb's iPhone view, you can see that the monthly potential actually got stacked on the left. So when you go back to our editor, you might actually, so you have a few choices. Like one, you can create like a really complex logic to make this left aligned, but then the easiest method is actually to create a separate group right here and make sure that they stack rather than falling all in one row. So what we're going to do is, since this has slightly different behavior when it's on phone, we need to pull this out of the parent group. And so on the UI builder, we can ungroup this. You can just like click these different elements and ungroup these elements. And we can group these elements together. And then let's make sure it is still correct in our responsive view. Not quite, because we need to potentially make this fixed width. And the same for the button. We still see a little complexity right here that is not exactly what we want. So let us undo that. We can fix that a little later. So for now, let us just stick with this one large group that behaves the same, because this gives us smoother behavior on phone, laptop, and as well as your tablet. So let us head on to the next section where we want an image. In Airbnb, we have this image with this little square form. So let us try and change this to a background of an image. So for background style, instead of a color, we're going to choose a image. And then we're going to upload an background image where there's the setting here where we can say crop the image to fit the element size. So that makes sure that your image is not distorted on responsive mode. And that's kind of something that you can play around with. There are a few other image options listed here where there's more information. You can see that in the reference if you hover over it. And that's something, if your image is too small and you want like a patterned tiled view, that's something that you can do. But for this, we're just going to keep crop the image to fit the element size. And then on top of it, we need this little thing that looks like a form on how much money you can earn. So for that, let's just draw a group. We won't create inputs because that'll take some time. So instead, let's just add a few text boxes. And I'm going to get some lorem ipsum to enter into that. So for this, just title works. And let's make this more consistent. So let's choose a subheading size, and for this, a body size. And let's choose some lorem ipsum from here. It's actually a lot of content. I'm going to shrink this a bit more. Okay, so this is not really meant to like be an entire form, but it is kind of representative. So let's see what this looks like in responsive. And you can immediately see that there's something wrong here. And we're going to be able to fix that very soon. So the first thing we want to do is that we want to make sure it doesn't go beyond its current width. So we need to set the minimum width to actually be 99%. So that when you're reducing the page width, we at least retain that size. Then there's one more thing, that when you actually move it along, like you can see in Airbnb, where on, let's remove the device view. So like when you are on desktop, it actually spans the full page. When you are on phone, it also like spans the entire page. And that's something that we want to do. Like in some places where there's space, it's a little square on top of an image. And when there's not enough space, it takes up the whole page width. So that's something that we will try and recreate by adding a group on top of which this will sit. So let's head back into the UI builder and add a group on top. So where did that go? Right here. Okay. Let's add a transparent group that actually spans the entire page. So it has to be, let's make that no color, and the edge of the page and the entire page width. Let's make sure it's actually tall enough for our little box right here. I think it should be. And then let's just move that into that group. Let's lock it into place so that it's kind of right aligned. And then let's center it vertically within that group. And then, so what we want is to set a few rules based on that group. So when we squeeze the page, we have an option to collapse margins when the container width is a certain page width. And so for that, let's make that 800, which is our tablet breakpoint. And so when we do that, you can see that this actually spans the entire page. And so we can get something that is closer to Airbnb's behavior. And so when you have a form right here, when you have a space, it'll be a little square. And when there's less space, it can take up the full page. So this part is done. And then the next thing we want to look at is a text-heavy portion of their pattern, which is like this, where you have these different paragraphs, very similar to another spot where you have these different paragraphs. And when you are on a phone, this stacks. So we want it to either spread or stack based on how much space there is. So back in our responsive, back in our own app editor, we're going to like first draw out these paragraphs, and then we're going to like set up some stacking action. So let us just draw. We can actually copy this over. We can make it a little bigger. So this can be about 350, height around 40. And we can make this width also 350, and no, that was too big. And then we want to group this because these need to move together. So let us group this into a bigger group. And for that bigger group, let's actually add a little space at the bottom. So let's make this height, just give it like a little bit of extra space so that you can see that there's the title, then there's a text box, and between the title and this text box is some space, and underneath the text box is some additional space. You'll see why this is useful in a bit. So if you copy this over, create like a second paragraph, you'll see that there are two blocks of text right here. And we can combine these because these need to be centered on the page. So let us group this again. And for this larger group, let us center it horizontally and let us center it vertically. And then let us see in a responsive viewer what happens when the page shrinks. So far so good. Like it's becoming narrower and narrower, but after a certain point, it's becoming too narrow. Like it stacks finally right here, but it could have stacked a little sooner because we see in Airbnb it stacks starting with a tablet size. So we need to like set some behavior that allows it to stack, and make sure that these text boxes have a minimum width that we're okay with, that is reader friendly. And so the reason why it actually takes so long to stack is because of Bubble's behavior of keeping margins constant. So Bubble will try to preserve margins based on your alignment until it hits a fixed block, which could be like your minimum width or maximum width. So going back to our original width, let us do a few things. So first, let's make sure it is center aligned because we want it to squeeze from the left and the right. We don't have a preference, like we don't want it to squeeze only on one side. And then we can add some logic for minimum width where if you look at our tablet and portrait, let us actually choose a size that makes it stack. So for minimum width, we have 20, but let's see what happens if you set this as 50. Nothing yet. Ah, that's why. Okay, hold on. We were trying to set it for the larger group, but what we actually need to set it for are these smaller blocks. So for these smaller blocks, let us make sure at tablet that it is taking up most of the space and stacking. So now we can see some kind of a stacking behavior. Let us repeat that for this box as well. And so here we had it at 87%. Let's do that here as well. So this stacks already in tablet, but let's see if this is actually too much for like the phone. For phone, it looks okay. We probably can reduce the margins a little bit more. So it is completely based on your preference, what you would like to do. So let's actually see this in our Chrome DevTools. And so on phone, you can see a little extra margin, which we can like fix. But for the most part, it is resized and centered the way we want to. Let's also confirm on our iPad size, still stacked and centered. And then on our laptop size, we can see that it's all in one row because it has enough space to be on one row. And then we can come up with a similar pattern for our list right here, which gives you a pop-up, which is these links that we had mentioned earlier in the session, where if you like click this, you get a centered pop-up. But on a phone, when you click this, it takes up the full viewport. So let us see if you have some time to do that. So I'm going to draw a repeating group right here. And then let me give it a fixed number of cells. I can say the rows can be 3 and the columns can be 2. And then for type of content, I already have some data types mentioned in the app. So let us just search on that so that I can get a few like test questions out here. Let's make this a little smaller because it needs to fit a title as well on the top. And let us center this horizontally. And then let's add a text element. And we can make this much bigger. And we can center this horizontally and vertically. And so let us actually see in our responsive view what that looks like. So it looks pretty bad on phone, but it looks normal on your laptop size. On your tablet size, also it looks kind of okay. So for our phone size, we probably need this to shrink. So we need only one column. We could probably do that even starting with our tablet, where we can see what is the maximum width that is required to take up a full page. And so for that, on repeating groups, we have this specific setting called current cell minimum width equals 100 pixels. So you can decide that based on your container. So if I know that on a phone, the container size is 375 pixels. So that's kind of how big this needs to be for the repeating group in general. So, so now you can see that it actually takes up the full width of your phone rather than trying to squeeze in 2 different columns into your repeating group. So let us see on our Chrome DevTools what that looks like. So this is our laptop view where we can see questions listed here in 2 columns. And then we change it to our iPad. And it's now on 1 column, just like we wanted. And on our iPhone, it is also still on 1 column. So I don't think we're going to have enough time to go over the pop-up example. So I want to like head over to your questions. So let me know in the chat if you have any questions that I can answer in the time that we have left. We can send out an email after this that'll include links to our recorded session. Any other questions? Just put it into the chat and I'll try to get to them. I realize there's a lot of content and we probably need follow-up sessions to complete this example, but one thing I want to show you before I end the session is a few resources. So definitely look at our manual, which includes a section on responsive pages. There's also like a more granular view, which I showed you when you hover over specific like checkboxes in the property editor, and that'll give you more information on it from the reference. And there's also a cool video online that can help you. And also the forum. The forum is a great resource while you're building your own app. So thank you so much for joining. And we'll probably need a few more sessions, but do reach out to us if you have any questions.